Every president faces a series of challenges, tragedies, history-making moments during their time in office. But for President Obama, several of those came all at once in just a 10-day stretch in 2015. It started with a shocking act of hate when a white supremacist executed 8 worshipers and their pastor in an historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and was followed by this powerful moment of forgiveness.
You took something very precious away from me. I will never talk to her ever again. I will never be able to hold her again. But I forgive you.
I forgive you and my family forgive you. But we would like you to take this opportunity to repent.
Although my grandfather and the other victims died at the hands of hate, this is proof, everyone's plea for your soul is proof that they lived in love and their legacies will live in love. So hate won't win.
How to describe that outpouring of humanity in the face of such hate. But at a memorial service in Charleston just days later, President Obama tried.
Amazing grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Cody Keenan was chief White House speechwriter for Barack Obama at that time, and when 2 huge Supreme Court decisions were handed down that week, all chronicled in his new book, aptly entitled Grace, President Obama and 10 Days in the Battle for America. Cody, congratulations. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Jim. Nice to be with you.
You wrote that speech with Barack Obama for that incredible day, that eulogy to Pastor Pinckney. He didn't want to give it, nor did you want him to give a speech. Why and why?
We'd already written a dozen eulogies at that point after mass shootings, Newtown, Tucson, a whole slew of them. And it was actually back in 2013 after he put his second term agenda on the line to try to do something about guns. And Republicans blocked background checks vote in the Senate where he said, I don't want to do this anymore. If we've decided as a country we're not going to do anything about this, then I don't want to be the one who goes out and gives a eulogy and gives people permission to move on, because we shouldn't move on from these. And selfishly, I didn't want to write it either, because we had just we looked at each other and said, we've run out of words. But it was that clip you just showed of the families and that act of grace and forgiving the killer that ultimately pushed us forward.
That was how does one change, if it isn't something like that, those incredible acts of grace, how does one change the mind of a president when he's dug in? Did he really want to not do it, or did he want to be convinced that he should do it?
It's a good question, because he would often push us into convincing him to do something, even when he already knew the answer. But it really was what those families did. He knew he should, and he knew he'd said on the Monday of that week that he wanted to go down and hug those families after that, but he still wasn't convinced that speaking would be the right thing to do. But it was, again, what they did. He ultimately said, fine, let's talk about race, let's talk about the Confederate flag, let's talk about gun violence, but wrap it all up in grace.
Cody, I think most of us have seen, I think it's Pete Souza's photographs of the edits, the hand edits by Barack Obama. But what he did to your near final draft, I don't know if you'd call that editing. You described it as lines through whole pages, the last 2 pages of that speech. Why?
Yeah, well, he was always our chief speechwriter, not me. He could always take our drafts to a higher place. But this was one of those speeches where we really needed him to be involved. And he's talked about this before, that he didn't give me much to go on, and I didn't give him something really worthy at the moment. And he called me back into the White House at 11 p.m. the night before that eulogy. And like you said, he crossed out the back 2 pages, and he'd rewritten them entirely in about 3 hours, using the lyrics of Amazing Grace as a structure for the speech, which was one of those things I kicked myself for not thinking of before that. But he's a good boss. He could have just said, you failed, get out of here. He could have excised me from the equation completely, but he brought me in, talked to me for about a half hour, made me feel better about it, and then sent me back to work on the speech for another few hours.
When Barack Obama would say to you, a speech was well written, what did that mean, Cody?
It was always followed with the word "but." He'd say the speech is well written, but we can do better. And that was always the case with his biggest speeches. And this week was packed full of them. He also had to speak in the book about whether or not the Supreme Court would find a right to marriage equality in the Constitution. There was a real chance that the Supreme Court was going to tell millions of Americans you don't get to get married. They were also ruled on Obamacare that week, and there's a real chance they're going to tell millions of people working 1-2 jobs that you don't get a right to health insurance. So we were cooking up a lot of stuff that week.
One last thing, you were among a very small number of people who knew he was going to sing, or at least thought it was very likely he was going to sing, correct?
He told us that morning on the helicopters. There were about 5 of us. We were on Marine One, and he said, if it feels right, I might sing it. And I kind of failed in my responsibility to notify the rest of the staff back at the White House. I forgot to tell anybody. So there were just about 5 of us who knew. Even the White House staff at the arena had no idea.
I remember what it feels like as a consumer of that to this moment. I'm sure everybody watching does as well. So as you mentioned, the same morning, right before he got on Marine One, he had comments to make after the Obergefell same-sex marriage decision came down for the Supreme Court. Here's a little bit of what President Obama had to say.
It is a consequence of the countless small acts of courage of millions of people across decades who stood up, who came out and stayed strong, and came to believe in themselves and who they were. And slowly made an entire country realize that love is love.
What would he have said if the decision had gone in the other direction, Cody Keenan?
Yeah, that was pretty dark. And we had to write that speech because you don't know which way the Supreme Court's going to rule, and you don't want to keep the country waiting for hours. So we had some legal backups planned, and there were still going to be states where it was legal. But that's a tough thing. That's a tough thing to say to people, that your country has decided you're somehow a second-class citizen. And what I was really dreading was we had a whole bunch of gay colleagues in the White House, and I was just dreading having to look them in the eye if the decision went the other way. But what's really interesting about that clip you just pulled out is that was all ad-lib. That was the end of the speech. He just kept going. And I think he was genuinely moved by the fact that the country had come so far so fast on an issue like that.
The rainbow lights, I assume, would have happened regardless. Is that right or no?
It is, yeah. Actually, there was a debate in the White House that week. What do we do if the Supreme Court says no? And a young man named Jeff Tiller on staff said that it's even more important to light it up and remind everybody that you have a place in this country.
Cody Keenan, we learned in the prologue to your book, you also wrote the Selma speech on the 50th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery over the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the violence that ensued from the state cops directed at the civil rights marchers. So you were central to that. You were central to the speech, the eulogy for Pastor Pinckney. Race was the centerpiece of so much of what the president said. You're a white guy. How hard was that to convey the thoughts of the first black president, in great part about race in this country, when you're who you are?
The hardest part was doing it justice. And fortunately, we had him, again, especially in those moments, he was our chief speechwriter. And I begin the book with the writing of Selma as a prologue because that really set up the thesis for these 10 days and really for politics. It was President Obama who added the line that politics is not just a clash of armies, but a clash of wills. Mm-hmm. And we're always engaged in a contest to determine the true meaning of America.
I'll tell you, it wasn't during these 10 days, but there's another moment in your book that I loved is I'm not sure, I think you were writing a State of the Union speech, which I can't even imagine how somebody deals with the endless things that have to be mentioned. But wasn't it during a State of the Union draft you were doing where he asked you if you ever listened to Miles Davis? Was that when it was?
Yeah, a State of the Union address will often make you forget good speech writing because you're just trying to cram everything in there. And he pulled me in about a week before the speech and said, listen, the entire speech is at a 10. And I need parts of it, down at 8, 7, 6. So I want you to go home tonight and don't do any work. I want you to listen to Miles Davis. And I said, why? And he said, well, the thing about Miles Davis is it's the notes you don't play. It's the silences. It's the spaces between. So I need some of that in this speech. Make the speech emotional, have some highs, have some lows, have some quiet moments, because they can say just as much as any other words. And that was pretty cool advice.
Well, there were also some pauses in his ad-libbing you described a minute ago after the Obergefell decision.
That's for sure.
Morning, everything that President Obama was the speaker, I think we'd agree Donald Trump was not. Crude, crass, intolerant, inarticulate, bullying and all those sort of things. But when you watch an audience in front of a very different kind of audience, in front of Donald Trump, he's remarkably effective as a speaker too. Is there a common thread, even though they're very few in terms of their ideology?
There's not. President Trump always spoke directly to his base and nobody else. There was never any attempt to change people's minds, bring the country together, show people what our obligations are as citizens. And anytime someone asks me, in today's modern media environment, do a president's words actually still matter and make a difference? I say, yeah, just look at President Trump, because those words can actually unleash some pretty awful stuff and turn each other against one another and make threats of political violence a very real thing. So yeah, president's words matter.
Well, let's talk about Barack Obama's words and whether they matter. We remember the legendary line, elections have consequences. Did his speeches have consequences?
I don't think they ever had negative consequences. At our best is like with the Charleston eulogy. He always practiced a politics, what I call a politics of redemption. He gave people the chance to change their minds without lecturing or scolding or, badgering people about the sins of the past. He's especially in that Charleston eulogy, by using the words, maybe we've been blind to the fact that racism still exists in so much of our society, or the Confederate flag still causes so much pain in people. Maybe we see that now. And that could be a more effective way. I put some letters in the book, too, from people who wrote in after that speech saying it really did change their minds. And it's very difficult to change people's minds today, but we still approached every speech as if we could.
Was it hard for Barack Obama, the person, to show that kind of, I don't know if you didn't use the word restraint, but I will, that kind of restraint in the face of such horror so many times in this country?
Yeah, as a president, you can't always let loose your base emotions. You do have to be a little bit restrained, not just because your words can move markets and armies, but they can actually push people away. And he was always very aware of that. And, one of the most gratifying things I ever read was when the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I respect and admire a lot, wrote after the administration that for 8 years, President Obama walked on ice and never fell. And I felt like that was like the first time I really exhaled after all 8 years in the White House.
You worked for Ted Kennedy. I know. I think you started as an intern, if I remember correctly, and obviously a speechwriter for Barack Obama. Fairly like-minded politicians, pretty similar world views. Could you do what you do for somebody whose worldview you didn't share? Could you do it effectively? Would you do it?
You can. I don't think it'd be a lot of fun. And I don't think I would. We just don't really have that tradition here. With every White House, there's a big changeover in speechwriting. I know a speechwriter, number 10 Downing Street, who I think is on his 7th or 8th prime minister now. It's just different. But he's been there for like 15 years. I just don't think it'd be as much fun. And I was very lucky to have two bosses who not just I agreed with on most of the issues, but who really taught me what politics was all about. And that started by working for Ted Kennedy here in Boston.
Well, Cody Keenan, the book is terrific. Great insight into not just speech writing, but into a president, and I really loved it. So thanks so much, and it's really good to meet you.
Thank you, Jim. Privilege.
The book again is Grace, President Obama, and 10 Days in the Battle for America. And tomorrow you can catch Cody at the Edward Kennedy Institute at 7, talking about his book with former Senator Mo Cowan. The event is free, but you should register for tickets at emkinstitute.org.